This story is entitled Insect Lady, and it's never been performed before. And you hit it who's on the violin, and Mark, who's on the piano. They've never heard this story before, but they were here last week, and we thought we'd try to, call it together and enjoy this experiment of sorts. Duck and cover. That's what we were taught as sixth graders at Francis Scott Key Elementary. But Bobby Ensign always peeked, because we were told not to look at the windows, because that's where this great light would appear, and then a wind. Bobby Ensign had an idea. Bobby Ensign always had ideas. This summertime plan would be to build an atomic bomb shelter. And then we'd be kings of the leftovers, because Bobby figured out there'd be TV sets for us and cars. Of course, the only person that would let us build a bomb shelter in their backyard was my grandmother. My grandmother, so sweet. Her name was Grace. She lived in the Middle Kingdom. She kind of propped up Pop Kaloff, this Jewish husband of hers who ran burlesque houses. She lived on 46th Avenue. Well, my entire family lived on 46th Avenue in the Sunset. It was my mother's idea. Since we couldn't live in one grand big house, which was her dream, we'd at least live on the same avenue. So aunts and uncles lived down the avenue. Far down lived my grandmother. And she would let us build an atomic bomb shelter in her basement. Bobby Ensign and I loved going to my grandmother's house. It was a treasure trove of things, particularly under the stairs in the basement. That's where my grandfather kept his photographs of the naked ladies in his burlesque house. I was the only sixth grader with black and white glossies of Tempest Storm. And the fan lady, and peeper scopes. My grandfather always wanted to make a fortune, and this was one of his many ideas. Tiny pink peeper scopes with naked ladies inside. Perfect for a bomb shelter. Or selling to other sixth graders. But beneath the peeper scopes, one day we dug into this box, and there was the smell of lavender. And in a lavender handkerchief, a gun. I had never seen a real gun before. It was much heavier than I anticipated, and there were real bullets. They weren't pointed like I thought, but they were blunt-nosed, like tiny daggers, and I loaded this revolver. I handed it to Bobby. It was heavy. Bobby pretended to shoot off the legs of Grandma's washing machine, and then I raised up and shot him out of a tree. Bam, 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 bam! He fell just like that Jap in the sands of Iwo Jima, did a full 1 1/2 somersault, whoomp! Broke his arm in 3 places. He was holding his arm as we carefully wrapped the gun back and placed it at the bottom of the box and thought of it for our atomic dreams. It was so much fun going to my grandmother's house. There was always these wonderful visitors, like my grandfather loved wrestling. So into our house would come Gorgeous George and the Sharp Brothers. And the Sharp Brothers were these little teeny bathing suits, even during the day. And these ladies, burlesque queens, would give us these great kisses that would fly off our faces. And then there was Willie Acker. Hi! Willie Acker lived in the basement, in the Naughty Pine Room. That's the curse of my family and the blessing of my family. We've always taken in people. Willie was taken in. I guess he was some refugee from World War II. That's what Grandma said. He lost his tongue and his heart. He only hummed. He was tall like a telephone pole and would hum and sit and play Chinese checkers for the hour and hum. Perhaps the strangest person to join this family was a guy named Myron O'Malley, a strange name for an Irishman. Myron? He plied the Sunset after the war, selling all kinds of kitchenware and wizardwick. Do you remember what wizardwick was? Wizardwick was this green liquid. You'd pull a wick out like a finger, and your whole house would smell like wizards. My grandmother had them all over the house. My grandmother's house was always so clean and smelled always of this wizardwick and incense that she burned like licorice. Myron. Whereas Willie Acker was quiet and hummed, Myron would come into the house smoking Chesterfields like a tornado. Well, Ronnie, me boy, we should be taking ourselves some things now. Don't you think this? The sunset, they're always waiting for something to die here. The sunset, waiting for the sun to come out, waiting for the children to graduate. That's the problem of the sunset, my dear boy. They're just waiting to die here. They'd sit down and kibitz for hours about the problems of the sunset. One problem lived next door. The insect lady. They'd been taking care of her for years, bringing her food. She would never leave her house. She would sit at the front window and scream. Every day we'd take her a box of Wheaties and place it at her doorstep. Watch the gate swing open, a hand reach out, and the Wheaties disappear. A yapping dog sound. One day, my grandmother and I took a box of Wheaties. We rang the buzzer as customary, and it buzzed open. Sunset houses are all the same, little tunnel entrance. I could hear a yapping dog as we walked up the stairs. The house reeked. It smelled of garbage, insects, and dog shit. The yapping dog moved down a canyon. There was garbage piled high as you could see. Unopened mail, clothing. Each step kind of set up a swarm of insects and flies. It was open and then settle. Insects scurried. She sat in the kitchen. There was no furniture in the house but this one formica table, red, pink robe falling off her body. Her skin was scabby and reddish and blotched and rashy, and she picked at herself and gouged at herself and unraveled herself and began to actually eat herself right in front of me. She grabbed her small dog and placed it in the oven, slammed the door shut. The dog is barking through the oven window, and she is gouging and eating herself alive. Insects! My grandmother and I quietly placed the box of Wheaties on the table and leave. The foxhole, our bomb shelter, is getting very deep. 12 feet, straight down, 4 feet in diameter, with little shelves for peeper scopes and water. We built it too close to my grandmother's house, and my grandmother's house is actually tilting into our bomb shelter. I'm not sure my grandmother knows, but I think Willie knows we're taking tons of dirt and throwing it over the fence into Insect Lady's yard. Time passes in the summer. The emergency becomes a crisis. The Insect Lady will no longer eat. The dog has stopped barking. We should be taking a kit now. We must be taking a kit. She's got to be eating something. We have to be taking a kit. And the social service department, they want her to come down and sign some papers. Can you imagine? She won't be leaving her house of hers. There's no electricity, no water. That poor dear of hers, she's got to be doing something. We've got to be doing something soon. Finally, Myron and my grandmother make a pact. They'll simply watch and witness as the Insect Lady no longer screams. She now only sits at her window and cries. 24 hours a day in and day out. 6 days pass on this vigil. On the 7th day, a policeman comes to my grandmother's front door. He is tall and waxy. His boots creak. His leather belt creaks and snaps. I think he's come to arrest me for digging a bomb shelter without a license. He takes my grandmother and I next door and into the insect lady's house. Doesn't he see? Can't he smell? The smell is gone. It now smells of licorice. My God, there's wizard whip bottles every place. The garbage is gone. Scraped away, placed someplace. Only the ring remains in the house. And lying in the kitchen is the insect lady, murdered. The policeman asked my grandmother, "Do you know this lady?" My grandmother says, "Yes." "Do you know a fella named Myron?" My grandmother nods, "Yes. He's back in Ireland." He begins to take notes. My mind screams over them. "Can't you see it? She's dressed in my mother's clothes, my grandmother's clothes. The shoes, the lipstick. Can't you see? Can't you smell?" He writes it up. Just another killing in the sunset. Boy, they sure have crazy killings in the sunset. Must have been a robbery. Yeah. Had to be a robbery. They cleaned the place out. Willie Acker's eyes greet my grandmother and I as we leave. I look up at my grandmother. "She was crazy, Grandma. She was crazy. She had to die. Someone had to kill her. Look at Grandma. She was nutty, Grandma. She was..." My grandmother simply wraps her arms around me. I look up into my grandmother's face, and she is crying. I had never seen my grandmother cry. She tells me about the insect lady, the garden she planted, the dances she attended, the life she had. She could tell the weather by the flight of seagulls. My grandmother held me so I wouldn't run away and pulled from her coat the smell of lavender as she brushed away my tears. The next day I went to see if I could find the gun. It wasn't in the box. In the bomb shelter, someone had filled it in. I used to think the danger was like the atomic bomb. It was far away and it was irrational. Danger is so close at hand, it's in your grandmother's basement. And murder is rational. So I drive by my house, my grandmother's house. Every day I do this. And I think about Willie Acker and Myron. I think about my grandmother and the lady that lived next door. Thank you. Wow, thanks, guys. That worked. One step out here.